Shall we think for a moment of happiness if you are really interested in being happy? At least interested in knowing what it means to be happy. You are most welcome. There are people who want you to think about the world to come, the birth to come, the life to come, all kinds of posthumous rewards, benefits, advantages, etc. What I have to say to you is something very simple, very immediate. Instead of all these high metaphysical things, shall we for a moment think about happiness? I don't think any one of us is averse to be happy. At the same time, I also cannot assume, I wish I could, that all of us are uniformly happy. It may well be that some of us are going through patches of unhappiness, frustration, disenchantment, resentment, etc. For whatever reasons, after all, life is not one straight line, there are ups and downs, and therefore, it's a mixture of happiness and unhappiness, laughter and tears, good days, bad days, high and low, so on and so forth. But even in the midst of the ups and downs of life, or the vicissitudes of life, if you want a more difficult word for it, um, it is possible to remain happy. In other words, it's possible to attain a state of happiness which is not vulnerable to be upset by the twists and turns that happen from day to day. In the midst of the storms of life, it's still possible to retain something of the calm of life. And this faculty is given to us, though human beings do not bother to take good advantage of it or make full use of it. So let us today concentrate for a little while on our duty to be happy. Not only the need to be happy or the desire to be happy, I believe that we have a duty to be happy. Now, let me make a beginning by quoting a few words by Jesus of Nazareth, where he says, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, all of you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." When Jesus looks at the human predicament universally, he sees this element of unhappiness as constituting an ineradicable element or constituent element of the human predicament. And he makes a special mention of it precisely because he wants human beings to be happy. Being happy is a spiritual condition. In Paul's letter to Galatians, when he talks about the fruit of the Spirit, he clearly mentions happiness, love, peace, joy. The word he uses is joy. So it's very obvious that the universal human condition is very often devoid of joy, whereas the spiritual condition should be characterized by happiness. But even those who seem to be spiritually highly developed seem to be miserable and unhappy. And what is worse, incapable of happiness every now and then. It's an issue that needs to be examined. Now, we know that of all the teachings of Jesus Christ, the one section that is universally popular and most famous is what's called the Beatitudes. You find it in the opening section of the 5th chapter of Matthew's Gospel. Blessed are the poor in spirit, that section. Or according to Luke's version, blessed are the poor. Now, blessed actually means happy. Beatitude, beatific, a condition of being very happy. So, Jesus is actually presenting his recipe for happiness. Though, if you go on to read the full recipe, you could get rather unnerved somewhat insecure, a bit bamboozled, somewhat unsettled, disquieted. And there is a point in it, and hopefully we'll come to an understanding of this. Now, for a moment, I would like us to close our eyes, and concentrate on ourselves and ask two questions. One, am I happy or am I unhappy? Surely it's a question to which all of us will have an answer, either happy or unhappy. Now, let's not take into account the state of being unhappy at this point in time. Let's concentrate for a little while on being happy. We are all happy. Let's assume that we are all happy. Therefore, the question is, what is the nature, what is the essence, what's the scope of my happiness? What is it that constitutes my happiness? That's an important question. That's because I'm fairly convinced, having meditated on this theme for a long while and meditated this in relation to my own various stages of life, I'm fairly convinced that by examining the substance or the essence of a person's happiness, you can arrive at a fairly good and adequate idea of his personality. What is it that makes you happy? Or, in your assumption, what is it that could make you happy? I remember a school teacher of some discernment asking standard 10 students as to what would make them happy. Somebody said, if somebody were to give me 100 rupees pocket money, it's a long time ago when 100 rupees mattered a lot, then I would go and do this, etc., etc. Another person said, if I get an opportunity to visit another country, I'll be very happy. And so on and so forth. Only one student said, I experience greatest happiness when I solve a mathematical problem. Now, I'm not saying that solving mathematical problems alone constitutes the ecstasy of life. I'm only saying that this individual was different to the rest of the class, and the teacher immediately recognized it. So it's very important for us to examine the substance of our happiness. Now consider for a moment what Jesus said in response to the temptation that Satan presented to him. Satan asked Jesus to turn stones into bread that he may assuage his hunger, his maddening hunger, after having fasted 40 days and 40 nights. And what does Jesus say to him? Jesus says, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Now, the simple meaning of that statement is that human beings can assume themselves to be satisfied with two different conditions, two different qualities of life, two different levels of life. In the first state, the first quality, if you like, a human being is happy to be living with bread alone. Now, a person of that kind finds happiness when there is an infinite variation of breads, the most exotic breads, the tastiest breads, perhaps the most nutritious breads, so on and so forth. And the acme of it, 5-star breads. He is in ecstasy. Now, of course, bread here does not mean only what we literally mean by bread. Bread is symbolic. It means all that meets the needs of our sensual life, life of the body. Not sexual, sensual, related to our senses, which also includes the sexual part. So, if all that we desire in relation to this understanding of ourselves only as a pleasure-seeking body If all those desires, expectations, cravings are met, then we are happy. Now, if a person is of this outlook or this disposition, according to Jesus, there is a good enough reason to feel sorry for him, because then he is not fully human. Human beings cannot live by bread alone. In other words, we need to also seek higher delights, higher nourishments. We have higher needs that need to be met. Unhappiness, very simply defined, is a state in which our fundamental needs are not met. We could also be, of course, because of cultural influence, seriously mistaken about our needs. After all, we are living at a time when culturally deliberate confusion is created between needs and desires. And we think that we have a need of all that we desire, which is simply not true. And it's because we are not able to distinguish between or discern the difference between needs and desires that we remain permanently restless and disenchanted, as well as in a state of mounting anxiety, which Jesus addresses in the 6th chapter of Matthew's Gospel from verse 25 onwards. So, our idea of happiness must therefore include happiness that pertains to the higher dimension of human life, which cannot be nourished or sustained by the pleasure of the belly cheer, or physical pleasures alone, physical amenities, physical nourishment, physical experiences, physical titillation, so on and so forth. Now, if we think that our happiness can be limited to the body alone, then we become in no way different from that particular member of the animal kingdom to which Jesus makes a reference in the 7th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus says, "Do not cast your pearls before swine, let they trample them underfoot and turn round and rend you." So, pigs. Jesus is saying that human beings can become like pigs, swine. What's the difference? What's the difference between a human being proper and a human being who is no better than a pig? The difference is that a human being who is equal to a pig, in other words, a human pig or a pig human, is happy with belly cheer alone, happy with physical titillations, physical delights, etc. And it has all kinds of ramifications. For example, what kind of literature would you read? What kind of videos do you look for on the YouTube? What kind of company you keep? And within the company, what kind and quality of conversation do you sustain or take interest in? What are the values, if any, that you subscribe to? To what extent are you willing to go in order to realize those values? Are you really interested in your personal growth and development? To what extent? So on and so forth. So it's important for us to realize that we do ourselves a terrible mistake by knowingly or unknowingly reducing ourselves to the level of pigs, de facto pigs. And we know the range of interest and therefore the scope of happiness that a pig has. A pig also knows its mode of happiness. When it comes across anything on the ground that it thinks it can eat, I'm sure the pig is happy. And of course, the pig would also be happy when it has the biological experience of mating with a fellow pig. Beyond that, what scope of happiness, we really don't know. And Jesus is also saying, being realistic, that a person, or human beings who live like this, they feel offended, enraged, incensed, angry, revengeful, violent, when you try to treat them to noble, higher ideas and remind them of the higher prospects of life. They don't want to even for a moment be reminded of it because it will then disturb them a lot. They react violently because they cannot deal with the emotional as well as spiritual turmoil this new awareness would breed in them. That's why many people recoil, many people run away. When you point out the avenue to higher happiness, believe you me, many people run away. They think of you as their mortal enemy. I'm sure you, like me, have had experiences of this kind. So these are issues that we need to really be clear. These are practical issues. What is the nature? What is the substance? What is the scope? What is the essence of our happiness? Are we happy? Do we want to be happy? There are some people who think that it is a wrong thing to be happy. And especially the pietistic Christians are of that kind. They think that a good Christian must always wear a funeral look, a look of bereavement. Sometimes when I post light-hearted videos, there are some of my friends who get very upset. Say, why can't you be serious? Why can't you talk to us about spiritual ideas? As though light-heartedness, feeling relaxed, is inimical to one's spiritual health. Somehow I'm not able to see the logic of it. So, the interesting thing is this. When we lead this kind of pig-like life, what happens is, we know that we are not meant to be pigs, and yet you are living no better than pigs. So some kind of deep unhappiness develops within us. It has a slow, silent birth, but gradually it gains upon us. And then this awareness begins to manifest itself both as boredom and as depression. Either as boredom or as depression. You can't be bored and depressed at the same time. And we know that today, globally, the two epidemics that everybody is talking about are boredom and depression. And that's the condition of humanity when it voluntarily accepts for itself a way of life which affords only pig-like happiness or pleasures or whatever. And people try then to treat this problem. And this problem is not of recent origin, it's been there. It has plagued humanity from ancient of days. For example, some people take a lot of delight in improving the material circumstances of life. I'm not saying that you should not improve the material circumstances of life. I'm not saying that a godly person must live in squalor, misery, poverty, destitution, deprivation, etc. That's not my argument at all. But I certainly want to say that the mere enhancement on the quantitative increase in material facilities cannot make us happy. And Jesus brings this idea home through a very beautiful but effective parable. It's known as the parable of the rich fool. A man's land brings forth plenty. He gathers up all this harvest and then he says to himself, you've gathered for yourself everything it takes to live comfortably, free from any want for the generations to come. Therefore, eat, drink, and be merry. Be happy. Eat, drink, and be merry. That's this idea of happiness. As long as there is enough to eat and drink, you're happy. A pig also is happy in that manner. That's why I introduced the image of the pig as a focal point of symbolic thought. There are other people who feel happy when they're in complete control of a situation. Cain's happiness was of that kind. He killed his brother Abel because he did not want any competition from his own brother to monopolize the affections or the favor of God. He felt deeply insecure because his brother found favor with God. And these are the control freaks of the world. They are happy when they are able to exercise complete control over others. There are some important leaders in our times, I will not mention them, who are of this kind. The Cain mentality leaders, They may be universally liked and adored. But the fact of the matter is that there is something seriously wrong with them, which people, because they have no spiritual discernment, may not be able to understand. You can pick and identify these people. I don't have to do it for you. There are other people, of course, who try to drown their sorrows, right? It's a very popular expression, drown your sorrows in various bottles. So there are two spirits. One is the Holy Spirit, and the other is the bottled spirit. More people have recourse to the bottled spirit than the Holy Spirit, because the bottled spirit, they believe, is far more efficacious in drowning your sorrows. There are other people who try to sort of treat their unhappiness with sexual promiscuity. Jesus deals with this issue in the 4th chapter of John's Gospel, where he tells the woman of Samaria, "He who drinks this water will thirst again and again and again." You will be drowned in the water with which you seek to assuage your thirst. I don't have to say more about this. Of course, there are other people who resort to hard drugs, all kinds of ways in which people try to increase their happiness. There are people who feel that they are very happy if they are in positions of prominence, public visibility, the iconic status, matinee idols, sports icons, so on and so forth, all kinds of things. I don't have to give you the many manifestations of this. But the fact of the matter is that in the midst of all of this, the reality is that globally, human unhappiness is mounting. And it needs to be addressed, needs to be understood and addressed. All I want to tell you in this video, of course, I won't be able to exhaust the scope of a subject as vast as happiness. By the way, happiness has been a main point of philosophical inquiry from ancient Greek onwards. So I'm talking about a subject of pretty great antiquity. The main point I want to make here is this. In all my many devotions, reflections, inner analysis of this particular state called happiness, human happiness, happiness as appropriate to human beings proper. The one thing that becomes very clear to me increasingly is this, that we have a need to be delivered from our dependence, or shall I use a stronger word, our addiction to lower forms of happiness. Let me use a more colored word, lower forms of pleasure, and to be led to the higher realms of joy and fulfillment. Would you feel happy? Would you feel happier if someone takes you to a 5-star hotel and gives you a massive meal, a 7-course dinner? He lays it on for you. Having eaten your stomach full, when you leave the table, what happens to you? Don't you feel all the more miserable? So, what was that happiness all about? It was happiness of the lower human nature. This is technically called belly cheer. Belly, of course, is stomach. Cheer is happiness. So, happiness of the stomach. So, if you think that you're only your stomach, then that happiness will suffice. But if you think that you're more than a stomach, then perhaps reading a good book may give you a greater degree, a greater level, a higher level of happiness than eating in a 5-star hotel. That's what I mean by saying that all of us need to be delivered from our addiction to, our limitation to, the lower forms of understanding and seeking happiness, and liberated from that to be empowered to seek higher forms and experiences of happiness. Let me give you some examples, then hopefully this will become clear. In the ninth chapter of Matthew's Gospel, verse 9, you see an episode in which Jesus calls a man called Matthew. He was a tax collector, a very lucrative job, very paying. And one look at him, Jesus realized that he was unhappy. He was making a lot of money, but he was unhappy. And maybe in the early days, weeks, and even months of his employment and his work as a tax collector, he would have felt quite excited. After all, the income was very good. Money was just pouring into his house. But increasingly, the problem of unhappiness began to get at him. And it's at that critical moment that Jesus encounters him. What does Jesus do? He calls him out. He says, "Follow me. Follow me." And what is happening to Matthew is that he is being led to a higher understanding of happiness and human fulfillment. He becomes the author of the first of the Gospels in the New Testament. If you can imagine the happiness that Matthew was entitled to before Jesus called him, and the happiness into which Matthew entered after this great inner deliverance and the transformation of his personality, you would see the difference that they have in mind. Incomparable. Incomparable. Or think again of the instance I've already referred to, the Samaritan woman. Jesus was actually delivering her from a culturally conditioned idea of the happiness that a woman was entitled to. After all, even today, every society that perhaps this is much less in Western societies. Certainly in Eastern Oriental societies, including Indian society, a woman's highest happiness is assumed to be found. She is expected to find her happiness in finding a stable relationship with a man, physical relationship. That was what this woman was trying desperately hard to achieve, but she failed each time she tried. And Jesus realized that she had a higher destiny. Jesus delivers her from that state, that lower state of living as an appendage to some men who couldn't care less, who couldn't understand the higher forms of happiness. If you happen to be coupled with a life partner who cannot lift her or his imagination beyond the pig-like, then God help you. God help you. That's all I can tell you. So a great deliverance is needed. And that's what Jesus does in the case of this woman. And you see her transformed. And see what she's doing. She's now trying to reach out to others to meet their needs. Till then, she remained confined to meeting her needs, which also meant meeting the needs of these men who simply used her and discarded her. Now she reaches a far higher level. We, of course, don't know what happened to her subsequently, but we certainly see a great transformation and a great outbreak of happiness, the sort of happiness she never dreamt of in all her life. Or think of the instance of Zacchaeus. He too experienced in great abundance the pleasure of grabbing and accumulating a lot of wealth. He became the richest man in the city, which is no mean achievement. But all the while, unhappiness was creeping upon him. One day, he decides to make a break. It results in his encountering Jesus. What happens? Jesus leads him out of his old or former understanding of happiness and the means to pursue happiness and takes him to a higher understanding of happiness and what it means to be human. And we see him celebrating that happiness. The personality of Zacchaeus becomes a celebration of happiness. He becomes happiness incarnate. This is real. This is something that we need to pay attention to. Let me close by being a little personal. My dear friends, I'm quite happy to say, I'm quite, if you don't mind, proud to say, I'm delighted to say that the happiness that I experience today is far better and far superior to anything I have ever known before. You might think that a man who has had a very hectic life that perhaps mattered in certain quarters, etc., post retirement would be miserable. He'd be like a kite that's cut off from its string and just drifting through the days appointed to him upon this earth, the remaining days. But that's not my predicament. It is today that I experience incomparable happiness. And I wake up very early in the morning because I just cannot wait for the day to begin. And as the day progresses and I'm able to do meaningful work, I'm able to cater to my own personal growth and development, I'm able to refine my inner life, I'm able to experience a higher scope of my personality, I can sense this very small, shall I say, trickling of happiness, like a small trickling of water on the side of a rock or a small hill, becoming a pool by the evening. One day, a long time ago, 1994, I had to attend a conference in Tübingen, Germany. It's near Stuttgart. So I landed in Stuttgart. And there was a missionary who had a lot of experience in Africa. He heard that I was coming and he expressed a desire to host me. So I found a couple of days to live with him in Stuttgart. It was he who came and met me at the Stuttgart airport, then made arrangements for my further travel to Tübingen, where the conference was. Now, in the evening on the first day, he took me to a very small hill. It was a hillock, if you like, on his land. And on the side, on the slope of the hill, there was a small little rivulet. You could barely see it. He was an agricultural expert, so he knew the value, the scope of this stream. He measured it and he found that the flow of water was equal to 600 bottles of water, single liter bottles of water per hour. From that, he calculated that if he trapped that water, he could create a good pond, which he did. And he began to farm trout, a very delicious fish called trout. I'm sure all of you are familiar with trout. And every evening, he and his wife would go there. He has an arrangement for barbecue, etc. And he would barbecue the fish and eat. So I saw the whole thing. So when I think of my experience today, I think of that small rivulet, a small spring of water, that small flow of water down the slope of that hill, which then gets accumulated at the lower level, at the plain, and becomes a pool. That's exactly my experience these days. As the day begins, it's like the flow of this rivulet. By the evening, there is a pool of happiness. I'm not exaggerating. This is truly the case. And this is a sort of happiness that no worldly achievement can give me. This is a kind of happiness that no public acclaim or some kind of great award, Padma Bhushan, Padma Shri, etc., can give me. It is rare, it's incomparable, it's matchless. And it's also this, the reality of this state that empowers me, gives me the confidence to deal with the topic of happiness. I sincerely wish that everyone who is part of this YouTube fellowship reaches this level of experiencing this inner growth of happiness, the daily renewal in happiness. It's a very beautiful, it's a very sweet experience. That's all I can say within my gross limitations of language. So, we're all entitled to happiness, happiness that befits our species, and that is not the happiness as the pigs know it. It's happiness as human beings alone are entitled to. And it would be a great pity if we fail to, or neglect to, or remain indifferent to seeking, attaining, and celebrating that happiness. Be happy. It's not only a need, it's a spiritual duty. Thank you.